You can still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Welcome everybody to the plenary session 2. My name is Michael Smith. I'm the Associate Medical Director for Mental Health in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and I'm really pleased to introduce this second session of the morning in what I like to think of as the Smith section of the programme. So you hear from me, then Matt Smith, and then after that, Danny Smith. So I'd just like to introduce Matt Smith, who is a Professor of Health History at the University of Strathclyde, which he joined in 2011. And Matt's range of interests is really very impressive. So it ranges from the history of mental health and psychiatry to allergy and immunology, food and nutrition, and childhood health. He's got several publications, which you'll see from his biography, but I can personally recommend his book, Hyperactive, The Controversial History of ADHD, and also a very impressive volume about deinstitutionalization and after, about the closure of psychiatric asylums. He's also a grant holder on a current project from the Scottish University's Insight Initiative about the potential of universal basic income to improve mental health. And that was the reason really for inviting Matt to speak to us today, because we're really very interested in the socioeconomic factors which can improve or harm mental health. And of course, in the COVID period, I guess in the UK, we've seen in the furlough programme the closest thing we've got to, or ever seen in the UK, to UBI that we might see for some time. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Matt to speak about social psychiatry, universal basic income, and the prevention of mental illness. Thank you, Matt.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, for that kind introduction. And I'm going to start right away with this particular slide. Now, you might wonder why I've chosen to show you some 19th century anti-masturbation devices. Well, there's a good reason for it, I think, and that's because in the 19th century, masturbation was thought to be a prime cause of insanity. And so these sorts of devices were prescribed to prevent patients, especially young people, from masturbating and going mad. Now, as you can tell from the one, especially the one on the right, these were taken quite seriously. Now, today, I doubt many of the clinicians in the audience would prescribe an anti-masturbation device or even suggest that their patients stop masturbating so they don't go mad. But let's think of another 19th century preventative measure, and that is the thought that if children studied too much, they would also run the risk of mental illness. Now, that is something, certainly for myself, working at a university and with 2 young kids, is something we probably do have to think a little bit more of, the pressures that we put young people under. So I raise these 2 19th century examples as instances of where we can learn from the past, both in terms of what we might want to do in terms of preventing mental illness and perhaps what we might not want to do. So I'll just proceed to the overview of the talk today. I'm going to very briefly talk about the longue durée, the long history of preventing mental illness, and then go specifically to my case study, which is the social psychiatry in the United States during the post-war period. Then I'll turn to universal basic income and finish with a couple conclusions. Okay, so going way back then, I would argue that for most of human history, the prevention of madness, or what we call mental illness today, was very important. Whether it be religious explanations, humoral explanations, or other explanations, there were attempts to work with people to prevent mental illness rather than just treating it once the problems had emerged. We see this very clearly in humoral medicine, which dominated in the West, and varieties of that humoral medicine in other parts of the world really for a good 2 millennia. So in humoral medicine is all about the balance of the humors: blood, yellow bile, phlegm, and black bile. And the excess of some of these humors cause health problems, including mental health problems. And the most the best example of that is an excessive black bile would cause melancholia. So the way to redress the balance or the imbalance would be to, yes, there'd be treatment, bleeding, purging, but also preventative measures such as ensuring that you had the right diet, ensuring that you rested enough and had enough exercise, and in some cases, perhaps moving to a climate that was more suited to your humoral disposition. So by the 19th century, we're starting to get other ideas supplanting humoral medicine, but the idea of preventing mental illness is still there. One of the disorders that emerges in the late 19th century is neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion. And this is really a prime example of a disease of civilization. So this is the time in which many cities, especially in the United States, are growing up and outward, and there's trains, trams, telegraph wires, all making life a lot more stressful and chaotic and hectic. And many neurologists in particular believe that middle-class people especially struggled to deal with these sort of assaults on the nervous system and would fall victim to neurasthenia. And again, in order to prevent that, lifestyle adjustments could be made. There are also biological causes of mental illness that are common during the late 19th century, such as pellagra, which is a vitamin deficiency disease, and general paresis of the insane, which is the third stage of syphilis. Pellagra, for example, would have afflicted many people who were in asylums in the north of Italy and the south of the United States, because the crops had turned to corn in those areas, and the poor people in those regions were not getting enough of the vitamins that they needed, and they fell victim to pellagra, which attacked the brain and would drive you mad in its final stages. And then finally, we turn to the 20th century, we have mental hygiene and child guidance movements becoming prominent, and these were very much preventative measures, or these movements very much prioritize prevention as well. So now I'm going to turn to social psychiatry and interest in prevention in the post-war period. And a lot of the interest, it does stem from child guidance and mental hygiene, but it also gets catalyzed by the Second World War. During the Second World War, there's a real desire to prevent shell shock, that afflicted soldiers during the First World War. And so psychiatric screening is done to weed out the psychologically unfit, and over 1 million American recruits are rejected on psychiatric grounds. Now, despite that, there's over 1 million hospital admissions for psychiatric problems during the war. And this really creates the idea within the American military, psychiatric, and political establishment that mental illness is much more common than previously thought. And so after the war, we see the foundation of the National Institute for Mental Health, and NIM funds a lot of projects to try to figure out what causes mental illness and what to do about it. And we also get a series of commissions founded to deal with the problem of mental illness as well. And here's a quote from one of them that focuses on children, that just kind of outlines how seriously they took the changes required. The commission should be ready to recommend a radical reconstruction of the present system. And that's not just the psychiatric system, that's the socioeconomic system as well. And we see the culmination of these ideas in a speech from John Kennedy in 1963, the real focus on prevention here. This speech really leads to the Community Mental Health Center acts in the United States. So we must seek out the causes of mental illness and of mental retardation and eradicate them. Here, more than in any other area, an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure. So what sort of causes is Kennedy talking about? The harsh environmental conditions which often are associated with mental retardation and mental illness. And I'm using the terms of the time there. So what was the intellectual heft behind these preventative ideas? Well, it was social psychiatry. Now, social psychiatry is often thought today in terms of community mental health centers, therapeutic communities, certainly over here in the UK, and in terms of transcultural psychiatry. But I think fundamentally during this period, it was thought of as a preventive approach to psychiatry. And it was also an interdisciplinary approach that saw social scientists teaming up with psychiatrists in order to really understand the epidemiology of mental illness and try to figure out what to do to prevent it, to prevent mental illness. So now I'm going to turn to 4 studies that really provide the spine for social psychiatry in the post-war period. The first one actually comes out of the pre-war period and looks at Chicago during the 1930s. So Ferris and Dunham examined admission data from 30,000 patients admitted to Cook County Asylum or Cook County Hospital psychiatric wards during the 1930s. And they found high rates of schizophrenia in particular in the deteriorated regions in and surrounding the center of the city, no matter what race or nationality inhabited that region. And as you can see from the map there, the dark areas are the areas with the highest rates of schizophrenia. Now, this book, it's worth looking at it if you ever have the chance. The map, there's about 50 or 60 maps in the book, which all plot different types of mental disorder against the geography of the city. And it's really interesting to just have a look and see how they did this work. They were both sociologists. And their conclusion was that poverty led to social disintegration, instability, and stress, contributing to confused, chaotic, and frustrated behavior. So after the war, we turn from poverty to social class, really. And this is a really interesting study of New Haven, Connecticut, done by sociologist August Hollingshead and psychiatrist Frederick Redlich, social class and mental illness. And it starts with this wonderful, wonderful sentence that is quite, well, it's interesting on today of all days. Americans prefer to avoid the 2 facts of life studied in this book, social class and mental illness. And they divided New Haven, which is a very old city, much older than Chicago, into 5 classes, with the lowest, the poorest class having the most mental illness and the worst treatment and support. And they found that with this lowest class, social stigma, disrespect, and even disgust led to low self-worth and hopelessness, and this drove mental health problems within this community. So moving from a small city, New Haven, we're going to turn to the countryside in Nova Scotia, in fact, the Stirling County studies led by Alexander Leighton, who was jointly trained in psychiatry and anthropology. So he was a real bona fide social psychiatrist, social science and medical background combined. And this study starts in 1948 and is technically it's still going. It actually had a publication in 2017. But the meaty publications came out between 1959 and 1963. And they're really fascinating anthropological studies of mental health in this rural part of Nova Scotia. They combine, in particular, analyses of the population that does work in the timber industry, woodlot. So people of Cove and Woodlot, the woodlot refers to people working in the timber industry, and the Cove people represent the fishermen. And Leighton and his colleagues find that social isolation, social disintegration, and stress lead to anxiety, depression, and other symptoms. Well, very similar findings are found in New York City as well. So this is the most ambitious of all the social psychiatry projects, the Midtown Manhattan Project. And the real stunning finding of this study was that only 18.5% of residents in this part of upper east side of Manhattan were in good mental health. 58% had moderate mental health problems and 23% had severe problems. And this study really touched on an ongoing theme in the 20th century about whether or not cities are bad or good for mental health. Now, interestingly, well, not all the authors of this study, but the leading author of the study argued that actually cities weren't that bad for mental health. But when you looked at who suffered most, again, we're looking at people who are isolated, who came from low socioeconomic status, and these factors were really a lot more important than whether they lived in the city and what ethnicity they came from. And interestingly as well, and I think this is something that is really key, physical health and mental health were hopelessly intertwined. So what was to be done about all this? Poverty, class inequalities, social isolation, all linked to mental illness. But what's really striking when you look at these studies is that there weren't that many suggestions about what to do about the situation. Not too many of these social psychiatrists were arguing that the socioeconomic structure of the United States should be changing. And that's partly because there was a real desire to get more evidence. And I think this is one of the problems we have in science and social science in general. Sometimes we have to draw a line and focus more on putting the research that we've conducted into action rather than getting more and more evidence. And in some other cases, the debates about what to do about cities and slum clearances overshadowed some of the underpinning issues about poverty and inequality. So what was done? I touched on this earlier, the Community Mental Health Centers Act of 1963, which really replaced the asylum in the United States, and quite quickly. These centers were formed during in the mid-1960s, and although they were meant to be centers for prevention, by 1970, only a fraction of the time resources spent in these community mental health centers were actually on preventive work. Most of it was treating deinstitutionalized patients. And here we have kind of the real issue for psychiatrists at this point. So on the one hand, we had psychiatrists who articulated that, we're not sure exactly how political we want to be. Do we want to just mental health as just clinical services, or should it be more about eventuating a more humane and emotionally healthy community? So that's kind of the one on the one hand. On the other hand, we have people like this, Matthew Demont, who talks about redistributing wealth on a scale that has never been imagined. The gap between the haves and the have-nots should be closed so quickly that for a while it should be seen to be reversed. And then once the United States has sorted itself out, we'll turn on the rest of the world to do the same. Now, this book is published in 1968. Demont publishes another book in 1992 called Treating the Poor, and it's a really sad book because all his hope is completely gone. This hope that the United States could change, become better for mental health, has totally gone down the pan. So why did this happen? Well, there are external and internal factors. There's a crunch between expectations and resources in terms of financial support in the Vietnam War era and during the energy crisis and 1970s more generally. We have anti-psychiatry, we have the rise of psychopharmacology. There's the problem of dealing with the currently deinstitutionalized, and many other issues that emerge. And basically by 1980 and DSM-3, social psychiatry is pretty much forgotten. It's certainly not being talked about by presidents anymore. So today, where are we today? Well, I would argue we're kind of in a similar position to that of the end of the Second World War in terms of concern about mental illness. And this was even before COVID-19. There is talk about prevention, but there's not much in terms of solutions offered. I think that's really the problem. We need to think about what do we do about this. And so I'm offering the solution, or not a solution, but a potential solution of universal basic income. So this is a cash payment to all people with no work requirement or no means testings. It eliminates much of the bureaucracy and stigma associated with the benefit system. And this is something that really loomed large in I, Daniel Blake, the Ken Loach film. It's something I've experienced myself. I used to work as a youth counselor in Canada, and although I was supposed to be counseling and helping these young people with their career, 95% of my time was just making sure they had enough money to live on. And in fact, although there isn't much in terms of policy recommendations beyond community mental health care during the 1960s in American psychiatry, UBI, or a version of it, is something that's proposed by the Joint Commission on the Mental Health of Children in 1969. So could UBI help to improve mental health? Well, here I'm basically just going to connect some of the possible outcomes of UBI to some of the issues raised by social psychiatrists in the post-war period. The first is poverty and stress. So we have fairly good research to show, both in terms of social scientific evidence, but also some biological evidence, that stress contributes to mental health problems. UBI is, I mean, the fundamental purpose of it is to eliminate poverty, to lift people out of poverty, and to reduce the stresses associated with poverty. It also allows people to leave domestic situations where they're trapped because of financial insecurity. And I think, again, this comes from my experience as youth counselor. It frees up resource to deal with social and mental health services, so that you can really deal with the intractable issues, things like addictions and the legacy of abuse, rather than just having to deal with people's financial situations all the time. And the metaphor I use is it gets Archimedes out of the bathtub. You know, Archimedes goes into the bathtub, the water overflows over the side, and to me, that's mental illness. Get Archimedes out of the bathtub. Archimedes is poverty, basically. So the other way in which it can help, I think, is dealing with inequality. Class inequalities have been linked to mental illness. This is really the point of the Spirit Level, Wilkinson and Pickett's book of a few years ago. And UBI helps to reduce inequality because it's provided to all, regardless of their class or income. And I think it's important that it provides an income to people in caring occupations, and we're probably going to see a lot more need for caring in the next few years, recovering from COVID. But it also provides for upward mobility. It facilitates higher learning, entrepreneurial activity, artistic endeavors, and career changes. And, you know, as a former careers advisor, this is often what prevents people from getting on with a new career, is that they just simply don't have the financial net to help them keep going towards something new. And this connects to the idea that's been discussed by Sir Henry Burns, a former chief medical officer. The diseases of despair reduces the hopelessness and shame associated with deprivation. And finally, I have social isolation. And this is more of an intangible, but I think it's loomed even larger in the COVID era that we're in right now. So social isolation was important regardless if you lived in Nova Scotia in the countryside or in Manhattan. Now, UBI, I think, could allow people to redirect their energies in ways in which they can engage in communities rather than just earning an income. And this could help create a shift from a focus merely on economic growth to more emotional and social growth. So you see in places like Bhutan, they have happiness indexes. You know, there's something slightly gimmicky about that, but also I think there's something fundamentally important about measuring the success of societies in different ways. And I think emotional and social growth is one way of doing that. So, in terms of evidence, there isn't a heck of a lot of evidence out there. Probably the best example is Evelyn Forget, who looks at the Dauphin, Manitoba basic income experiment from the 1970s, where reduction in mental illness and hospitalizations were experienced. But I see it as something where we just need a lot more, we need to try this out. And a lot of what I'm saying is that the mental health people need to get in touch with the UBI people and figure out how to bring about more evidence to support this. So just some conclusions now. I'm not arguing that UBI is going to solve all mental health problems. As you saw in the first slides there, I'm very well aware that mental health problems are caused by a wide range of factors. But I think there are things we can do that would reduce the preventable mental health problems that we experience in society. And if we're serious about prevention, I think we really need to start thinking politically. We need to focus on socially progressive policies, and UBI could be one of them. On the one hand, I think mental health charity
preventable mental health problems.
Oh, sorry, I heard myself there. So, and as I was saying, mental health charities and professionals, I believe, should become more vocal and really demanding these sorts of policy changes. And on the other hand, UBI advocates need to ensure that mental health is a key factor to be considered in any pilots that they run. I think if UBI is ever going to become a reality, health will be one of the main driving drivers of it. And finally, this is something that will also help people currently dealing with mental illness who face enormous financial handicaps themselves. The easy bit is researching the connections. The hard bit is putting in the socially progressive policies in place. And I think that's where we are today. So as Michael mentioned, we are running this project. It's just a knowledge exchange project exploring UBI and mental health. There's some workshops coming up. What I would say, if you're interested, just get in touch with me or the Scottish University's Insight Institute for more. And there's a feedback form on the website for the conference that you can provide me with some very basic feedback about my talk today. But I'll leave it at that. And if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Are we back? Okay.
I'm hoping people can hear me now. Oh, goodness. Right, technical hit. Sorry about that. Matt, thank you so much. As expected, that's a fantastic overview. It's just so comprehensive and it helps give the context, I guess, to the current moment. And I suppose I'm just thinking before we go to questions, in some ways, it's really impressive that scholarship over decades has shown such a clear link between mental health and poverty, but maybe at the same time kind of depressing that we haven't actually managed to make a change. And I guess that was really something I wanted to think about. You mentioned there's a few suggestions, but we tend to be a bit wary of getting involved in politics. But I wonder if there's not really a way of engaging in this. If we're trying to make a change, it needs to be political, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And if I turn to one of the things I've done in my research is interview people who are involved in social psychiatry during this period. And one of the things that looms large in those interviews of many of the Americans is that while, yeah, they would have voted for Biden, they probably would have voted for Bernie Sanders, but they weren't. They were also very concerned about their career, and for example, in the Midtown Manhattan Project, some of the social scientists had been working for that had been blackballed because of the McCarthy investigations on anti-American activities. So, you know, for them, they were interested in social psychiatry. They wanted to see changes, but they weren't always willing to articulate what really needed to be done. Matthew Dumont's book, I think, is one of the few examples where it really gets articulated, but also in the Joint Commission on the Mental Health of Children, that's really the main document that articulates it. But in a way, it comes too late because by then, the United States is entering more of a period of decline economically. Nixon is in the White House, and the war on poverty has been is almost being lampooned at this point as a boondoggle rather than something to continue towards. So, but I think today, what we're experiencing today is everything is being amplified. Like I said, it's like the Second World War again, in the sense that mental health is just right there in front of everyone. And just imagine if, however months we are into COVID, if we had had a universal basic income, it's like Archimedes in the bathtub again. We would have been able to cope so much better with this situation that we find ourselves in.
Thank you, Matt. That's really helpful. I'm just scanning the comments and the questions. I think there's a few. So just to pick up on a question from Donald McIntyre, and actually also from Ashley. So the sense is that, as you said, that the UBI trials are reported as failures. But what are the parameters of the failure? So Ashley saying, well, Donald's saying, were they actually failures? And Ashley saying, was social capital considered as part of those outcome measures?
Yeah, that's one of the problems, is that the UBI trials, they have, a lot of them have been considered successes, but they don't measure mental health. That's probably, I should have made that clear. They don't tend to measure mental health. They're very much measuring economic outputs. Yes, they'll look at something like, did people try to get a job? Which, yeah, that's very important. In many cases, they do try to get a job, even though they're on universal basic income. But what leaks out of these pilots unintended are the positive mental health outcomes. So in the Finnish trial, there's an interesting video that has gone the rounds about that, and it's all about positive mental health outcomes. Same with Ontario. The Ontario one was stopped because there was a change in government, and the new idiot premier of the province decided to kibosh it. So, but that one was showing mental health outcomes. But I think it has to be and not just mental health, but health outcomes have to be measured. And because I think that's one of the key ways that we'll see this happen, if we ever do.
Thanks, Matt. That's really helpful. Actually, that ties into a couple of the comments. You might be able to see them. One from Neil Watson, who's saying, if a policy like this is ever debated, do you think clinical perspectives need to be taken into account? And Rachel Thompson making a similar point, I think, about, do mental health charities, practitioners need to get more involved in promoting UBI trials in Scotland?
Yeah, no, I would absolutely, they do. So I've done a few talks like this for Mind down in England, and I have, conversations with people afterwards, and they say, oh yeah, that sounds really good, but we're a charity that's heavily reliant on donations, and often those donations come from big business. And so how can we make these bold political statements and continue to exist? In an ideal world, there'd be a basic income for charities too, and we would, they could say what they wanted. But I would love to see the mental health charities in Scotland really come together on this one and say, listen, if we're serious about preventing mental illness, let's at least run some pilots. Let's see what happens in terms of mental health outcomes, and then if there are positive outcomes, then really take the message to the government and say, let's do this.
Thank you. Yes, and an interesting comment from Sandy McAfee there, which is, I guess, this is how it's framed and how the case is made, because what he's touching on is it's not possible to think about the poorest without also thinking about the psychology of the richest. So I suppose the question is UBI a zero-sum issue, which is improving the financial situation of the poorest? Does that necessarily take money from the richest, or is there a way in which it could be to everybody's benefit? Have you any insight into that question?
Yeah. Well, I think it's obvious that I think one way of looking at it, and this takes us away from mental health slightly, but not necessarily, is that if you do have positive health outcomes, if you do have fewer people needing time off work for mental health reasons, if people can leave their job if they're feeling miserable and have that buffer to get to another job, and resulting in a happier workforce, that's going to be better for the people that run the businesses as well. I think it also, the potential entrepreneurial benefits are really, for me, there are a lot of right-wing big business entrepreneurs out there that are actually quite in support of basic income. Now, not always for the right reasons, I would say. They're not necessarily interested in reducing poverty, but they do see it as is it something that could drive creativity and entrepreneurialism in society. And even there was an article on the BBC website yesterday on some of the businesses that have popped up in Scotland during COVID. COVID has provided a bit of a catalyst for some of these people to start their businesses, and I would love to see what people in Scotland would do if when you were starting a business, you didn't have to worry about your income. You could just focus on the business. I think that could be really exciting. So I don't think it would be a zero-sum game. I do think that, I'm not an economist, but when I think about it from a, I guess, more holistic perspective, I do see it as something where a lot of people, or most people in society could benefit, and in different ways, not just economic benefits, but other ways as well.
Thanks very much. And yeah, and a couple of comments there from Elizabeth Kirkham and Neil Watson again, just continuing that debate a little bit. So unfortunately, we're going to run out of time in a moment, but I think it would be nice. I suppose my observation would be UBI requires a high degree of citizenship and trust in your other citizens. And I guess that what will determine its success is really the extent to which that can apply in Scotland. I think we're going to have to wind up there because we've run out of time. Can I just close? Firstly, can I thank everybody who's contributed the questions and the comments in the chat? That's been really supported a really interesting discussion. And finally, Matt, thanks very much again for joining us this morning. Thank you.
Most welcome.